Ny dag på Skaperkonferansen. Det ser ut som noen litt trøtte kanskje, men så vi som her, vi trenger også våkne. Så vi skal starte med å synge en sang. Takk Gud for vakre morgenstunder. Og så blir det litt grann informasjon før Robert Carter slipper til. Går an å våkne sånn, gjør det ikke det? Vær så god, Tom Børge.
Bare sånn veldig kjapt så har jo ungene gått bort til Kongstuen, de som fra andre klasse og oppover. Mens de som under andre klasse, så det et rom bak der det går an til å leke. Og så det, hvis den oppe, så kan en ha ungene med opp også, men det greit at det de som under andre klasse, da det greit at det en voksen med, sant, som har et oversikt, og så har dere en ansvar hvis at ungene stikker opp og sånn, så det ikke noen som passer på de oppe, så det kan være greit å liksom ha et øye med dine egne unger, sant, sånn at det ikke meg som har fått ansvaret for ungene dine når du kommer her til. Eller noen andre. Bortsett fra de som har barneopplegg der borte nå. Der har de full kontroll. Ok?
Ja, det vil være en inne på det lekerommet bak i salen her også, så der det mulig å la de få lov til å leke litt grann fritt, så du kan få med deg litt av det som skjer her inne. Som sagt, velkommen til en ny dag. Vi ønsker å legge denne dagen i Guds hender aller først. Kjære Herre, vi vil takke deg for en ny dag som vi sang om. Takk, Herre, for alt det som du har skapt. Takk for alt det som du har gitt. Takk for din nåde som bærer. Takk for styrke for dagen, håp for morgendagen. Herre, vi ber deg om at du nå vil være her med oss ved din hellige ånd, at du må la oss forstå og se storheten, Herre, i det du har gjort. La oss få lov til å få stille hjerter som klarer å få med seg det som blir sagt på seminar og gjennom lovsang og gjennom alt som blir gjort denne dagen. Vi takker for at du har lov til å være med oss i Jesu navn. Amen. Da skal Robert Carter få snakke til oss om et veldig spennende tema. Jeg har jo fått plukket hans hjerne litt grann noen dager og fått litt grann mer ut av dette her. Og vet at det dere får høre nå ganske spennende, og det handler om på en måte hvor nær slekt vi egentlig alle sammen, selv om vi kan se veldig forskjellig ut og oppleve at det store forskjeller mellom oss, så vi likevel en rase. Vær så god, Robert Carter.
Du vaken? Klokka 3:30. Anyway, that's all my Norwegian I know. Was anyone not here last night? Okay, a few of you. My name is Robert Carter. I work for Creation Ministries International out of our U.S. office near Atlanta. I'm a geneticist. I'm also a Christian. We're going to talk about another difficult subject, the subject of human races, how evolution treats human races, where humans came from, what the evolutionary story is, and what the biblical story is. We're going to have to get into a little bit of genetics, so I need to establish myself here. My doctoral work was in coral reef ecology. I stole the genes out of these animals and engineered them into those animals. So my background is in genetic engineering, but I don't do that anymore. Since then, what I do is I write computer programs and I analyze data. So I have a hard drive here with the 1,000 Genomes Project on it. I have 1,000 human genomes right here. And I'll sit here and write in Perl or Python and analyze data and try to generate new models of human history because it's fun. I've written scientific papers on things like mitochondrial Eve, the one woman who's the ancestor of all people alive today. The evolutionists had talked about her, but they never calculated what her sequence was. So I published this in Nucleic Acids Research several years ago. I've done other studies on the influenza genome, specifically the H1N1 influenza virus. That was a very interesting thing, looking at how mutations accumulate over time in a virus that's under strong natural selection. And I was able to show that natural selection doesn't apply, that the virus is accumulating mutations despite natural selection, and therefore it's doomed to extinction. Interesting. That applies to something called genetic entropy. I do work for Creation Ministries. We publish a lot of things. So we have several things out here on the tables. I saw Creation Magazine, a fantastic publication. I hope you would get it for your families and for yourself. We also have a gigantic website called creation.com. We have something like 13,000 articles on our website. So if you're interested or if you have a question, you can go and you can type something in the search box, and I can almost guarantee you're going to get an article that addresses that. And if not, send us an email. I mean, I might not answer it. It's going to probably go to our UK office, but they might send it to me, and I'll try my best to answer it. And sometimes those answers become new articles. So feel free to email us because we have stuff we want to share with you. In fact, we have on our website a number of articles that are in Norwegian. They've been translated. So some of the most important articles, we put them there for you to read, for you to be encouraged, and for you to share with other people if you're interested. We also have a Friday afternoon email that goes out. So if you want to plug into the type of information we're generating, just go to our website, click sign me up, and all you need is an email address, and we'll just send you something once or twice a week. Anyway, that's Creation Ministries. We're going to be talking about where people come from. Now, this is a fascinating question for me. I've been searching for my family my entire life. I am a nerd, as you notice. So give me my things that I love: genealogy, geography, and Google Earth. And I'm going to draw lines on maps that connect where all my people were born and where their children were born. And this is all of my lines that leap across the Atlantic Ocean. So looking at me, you already know that I'm Northern European. That's obvious. I look at most of you, not all of you, but most of you, obviously you're Northern European. Why can you do that? Why can you look at someone and know from where in the world they come from? That's a good question. Well, I'm a typical American, the melting pot. I have ancestors from Ireland, many of them. I have 5 lines that fled the Irish potato famine. I have ancestors from England, from Germany, from Phrygia, and there. That's actually in the wrong spot. When I drew the map, I didn't know where my ancestors lived. Well, I went there yesterday, to Konsmo, and I saw where my great-grandfather was born, and his parents, and his... So if you look at me genetically, here's some charts from 23andme.com. You can see, look, I have northern Netherlands, southern and northern Ireland. In fact, that's my father, and that's my mother. It's really funny. Germany, and that. So yes, I am part you. But how far can we go? If you want to trace your family line, how far can you go? Not very far. Maybe to the 1800s. Maybe some church records, you can get back to the 1600s, maybe a little earlier. But what about before that? Where do the Europeans come from? They don't come from Europe. They had to come from somewhere else. So I'm tracing my family. This is my mother and her brothers and sisters, the Torkelsons. And I find my grandfather, Torkelson. Pardon my pronunciation. I can't pronounce it like you pronounce it. And I find out that he's living as a little boy on an island off the coast of Georgia. And he's building, his father, my great-grandfather here, was born here in 1865. And somehow he ended up in the U.S. building mansions for the richest people in the world, like Rockefeller and people like that, who all had mansions on Jekyll Island. But my great-grandfather is dying of tuberculosis here. These two boys are going to die of tuberculosis. That's a second girl named Jenny. She's also going to die. And the mother is going to take her surviving sons and move back to New York and live in a slum. From hobnobbing with the richest people in the world to living like the poorest person in the world overnight. I love stories like that. The humanity of people is amazing. But I can dig down into the records now because you have all of your records online, and I find my great-grandfather and his parents and his parents. But that doesn't tell me anything about really where I came from. What about Europeans? How many of you have heard that Europeans descended from Japheth? Yeah, that's probably not true. But it's what we've heard. When we look at the earliest layers in Europe, we find Homo heidelbergensis. We find Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were there, and then a group of people moved in. They're called hunter-gatherers. They didn't have farms. They lived off the land. They ate mushrooms. They ate shellfish. They fished. They hunted game. They had a rich and varied diet, and you had to be very smart to live off the land. You had to be very attuned to nature or you die. So these very intelligent, very industrious people lived all over Europe, but we've now sequenced over 100 of their genomes. They carried genes for dark skin and blue eyes. Dark skin and blue eyes, that's a weird combination. But all of them, as far as we know, had that combination. Later on, a group of farmers moved in from Turkey, from Anatolia. They moved up into Europe. They mixed with those original people. So therefore, there are Neanderthal genes in the farming people. And that's the first time that light skin gets up into Europe. But if light-skinned people intermarried with dark-skinned people, what's a race? They're more different to each other, and they merged. They're more different to each other than current Europeans are from Chinese people. And that's us. Most of us, sorry. Some scientists were digging an archaeological site in Denmark, and they found a piece of birch tar that people would chew, like chewing gum or even early toothpaste. Keep your teeth clean, very sticky. And they found it, and they realized it had human teeth marks in it. And they said, oh, we can pull the genome of that person out. And they sequenced the genome of a woman with dark skin, dark hair, and light eyes. But they also found hazelnut and duck DNA, which is probably her last meal before she spit this thing into the bog. And yet, that's not a typical European, is it? Where do we come from? Honestly, my people were living north of the Caspian Sea, in Central Asia, in the grasslands. 70% of my genome is Asian. And there was a massive wave of people in ancient times that migrated into Europe. You've heard of Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun. Yeah, they were late. The earliest invasion comes from there. And this is probably the source of the Indo-European language family, which is why Norwegian has so many similar words to Sanskrit in India. Because it was a dispersion of people that brought their culture, their genes, and their languages across this vast area. That's really what I am, mostly. I'm a little bit hunter-gatherer and maybe 2 or 3% Neanderthal. Two famous evolutionary geneticists, Slatkin and Racimo, they wrote this a few years ago. We now know, I love that. When a scientist says we now know, do you know what that means? It means we were wrong yesterday. But because scientists have usually been the smartest person in the room their whole life, they don't like admitting that they're wrong. This is true across science. It's really weird. But we now know that present-day populations were created by a complex history of admixture and population movement, although local genetic continuity over long periods has been documented in a few cases. These are exceptional. The general rule is that the ancestors of present-day populations lived somewhere else. Oh, that's very interesting, isn't it? That means that history is fun, history is complicated, and it's probably not what you learned in high school. It's something else. And it means that people have moved a lot across the planet in human history. And yet other weird things pop up. These two men were best friends. They fought together in the Vietnam War, but they're Australians. Notice, one of them is an Australian Aboriginal. The other one has obvious European roots. In fact, his nickname is Snow. Bill, on the left, as an old man, got kidney disease, and he could not find a donor. So his friend George, on the right, said, "Test me," and everybody snickered. How can you possibly even think you might be a match for that man? Your families have been separated for 30,000 years. And yet they were a match. And Bill lived the rest of his life with one of George's kidneys. That means that we are all very closely related, much more closely related than the evolutionists want us to believe. The only way for a genetic match, and you don't just match one thing, you look at like 100 different factors. It's not just blood type. There's a lot of things that they test to make sure that it's not going to have a rejection of the organ. And yet they matched because they're really cousins. Think of this. If Noah's flood was, say, 4,500 years ago, the average human generation time today is about 30 years. Average. Because women can have children from about the age of 15 to about the age of 45, and not so much on the ends, but mostly in the middle. The average is 30 years. What's 4,500 divided by 30? What's 450 divided by 3? About 150, right? There's only been about 150, maybe 200 generations in all of human history. We really are kissing cousins. And that shows. So again, I ask you, what is a race? We get to ask the other question. What might have Adam and Eve have looked like? Well, that's not Eve. And that's not Adam. That beautiful woman produces almost no eumelanin, the brownish pigment. But she produces a lot of pheomelanin, the reddish pigment. All people produce pheomelanin except for albinos. And some people don't produce much eumelanin, which is a brownish pigment. But that boy produces as much eumelanin as a human body can possibly produce. Very handsome people. Lovely people. What separates them? The main skin color gene that we Europeans carry is one letter different. One letter. Out of a 3 billion letter genome, what's 1 divided by 3 billion? That's the percent difference that we have with other people when you look at skin colors. So what's a race? What separates us? Attitude, culture, visual appearance, which is irrelevant. You can look at the stereotypical, think of a person, right? Think of someone from Asia, right? You have a stereotypical view of what they look like, right? There are a lot of different looks in Asia. In fact, all the things in Asia you can find here. Usually at low frequency, but there are people with almond-shaped eyes here. There are. There are people with round eyes in China. There are. It's just a frequency thing, and so we get the stereotype thing in our heads, and it actually doesn't work when you look at it more deeply. You okay with that so far? This is a map of skin colors. Now, this makes me uncomfortable because this is collected prior to World War II. And essentially, all of the anthropologists prior to World War II were deep racists. They were European people who thought that they were on the top of the evolutionary ladder, like Charles Darwin taught, looking around the world. So, but this is data, and data is data. Data should be neutral, right? So what they did is they took a card, and they went around and they looked here on people's skin. Why? Because it doesn't get any sunlight. That's your skin color. This changes throughout the seasons. But they looked at under people's arms at that skin around the world, and they graded them, and they made this map. And that's very, very interesting. But we now know the evolutionary story doesn't work. How many of you have heard that black people are black because they live near the equator and it protects them from the sun? Well, how come people in Ecuador that live over 1 mile in altitude don't have dark skin? How come the people that migrated down into the islands many, many thousands of years ago, most of them don't have dark skin? What's going on? How come there are light-skinned people in southernmost Africa? Relatively light. Former President of the United States, Barack Obama, had an African father and a European mother, and he was middle brown. He wasn't very dark. The people, the Khoisan Bushmen that live in southern Africa, they have middle brown skin, just like the Egyptians and the Libyans and the people up here who have thoroughly mixed with Europeans over time, but they have lighter skin than the Central Africans. The crazy thing is, if you went to Africa at the time of Christ, there would not have been nearly as many dark-skinned people. Something happened in African history. It's called the the Bantu expansion. The Bantu peoples who lived in Central Africa expanded eastward and southwards, maybe 1,000 years ago, maybe 1,500 years ago. And they displaced the people that originally lived there. And we know that because we found some ancient bones in a rock shelter or in a cave in a high mountain. And so we know the bones and the DNA now of the people that used to live here. And the DNA is similar to the people that live only in southern Africa. There was a wave of migration of darker-skinned people moving across Africa, just like there was a wave of migration of lighter-skinned farmers coming from Anatolia and displacing the darker-skinned people that once lived in Europe. Because, as Slatkin and Racimo said, most people live somewhere else in history. And these so-called racial groups have moved and migrated and intermingled throughout history. And here's the crazy thing. The genes that cause darker skin in Africa are the same exact genes that cause darker skin in southern India and in Australia and in what's called Melanesia. The same exact genetic variants. And the same variants that cause lighter skins in southwest Africa, we find them in North Africa also. What this means is the skin colors didn't evolve. The skin colors were in the population as we spread out. The skin colors were on the ark because they were in our population at Babel. This is God-created diversity. This isn't mutation and evolution over millions of years. Oh, that's really interesting, isn't it? All of a sudden, we can explain the rise of races without any need for evolution. Now, there are some benefits to different skin colors. If you have really dark skin, your skin protects you from the destruction of B vitamins, folates. And folates, if you've ever taken prenatal vitamins, you take the folates because it prevents spina bifida in your child. You need those vitamins. Well, ultraviolet light destroys those vitamins. Darker skin also protects against fungal infections in the skin. During the 1800s, tens of thousands of Europeans went to Africa to spread the gospel. and they dropped like flies. There's one story of a missionary where the first thing they did when the missionary arrived, they brought him to the graveyard and said, "This is where all the people before you are." And he goes, "I died before I got on the boat." Giving his life to spread the gospel to a continent that was without the gospel. And today you cannot talk about Africa without talking about Jesus Christ. There's so much Christianity on that continent. Now, it's not everywhere. I understand. There's strife. I got that. But Christianity has a huge footprint in Africa because of all the work of all those white people who died trying to share the gospel. And yet, up north, it's not a benefit to have really dark skin, because this light skin color allows me to make a lot of vitamin D with very brief exposures to sunlight. So that's a benefit. There are trade-offs here and benefits, but it doesn't mean that evolution produced these things. These are things that were in us at Babel. You okay with that? Okay. So I would say that Adam and Eve probably looked like somewhere in the middle. Brown-eyed, brown hair, brown skin. Because if you take all the racial groups in the world and mix them together, you get someone that looks like that. In fact, the most mixed people group in the world that I know about are Puerto Ricans. That's the one island in the Caribbean where the Spanish didn't kill off all the natives. And then they imported a lot of black Africans. And so you had Spanish or Europeans and Africans and Native Americans, and they mixed together into one giant mixed population. And most Puerto Ricans are in the middle. Interesting. Okay, but how do you start with that and get this? How does that happen? Well, it's through a process called inbreeding. When people only marry within a small group of people, genes tend to get lost over time. And we have a great example of inbreeding in the Bible. This is the family tree of Terah, the father of Abraham and Sarah. And Terah had Abraham, Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. But Abram married his half-sister, Sarah. So Isaac is equivalent to a son of Terah, even though he's the grandson. And then Isaac married his first cousin once removed and first cousin twice removed times 2, Rebekah. That's like marrying a sister at this point. And they had Jacob, who married his first cousin Rachel and first cousin Leah, but they're much closer than first cousins because all these different lineages from Terah. And by the time these brothers are born, you know how you inherit half of the DNA of each of your parents, right? You get half dad and half mom. Well, that means you're 25% of your grandparents. Of your 8 great-grandparents, you're 12.5% of each one of those. You're 6% of your great-grandparents. By the time you go, if you take the longest line here, these boys and Dinah should be 3% of Terah. But because they inherited his DNA in multiple different branches, they're 22%. And because of the laws of genetics, a lot of the times you would have 2 identical copies of Terah's DNA in all the brothers. So if in there was a gene that affected height or weight or the shape of the nose, curliness of the hair, you could be walking down the street of some ancient village and go like, oh, there's an Israelite. Because they would have stood out. Because when you have inbreeding like that, you lose a lot of genes, and it concentrates certain genes, and they're going to look different. This type of a formula has happened in little villages across the world throughout human history. Most people in history married someone born within about 5 miles from where they were born. In fact, most people married cousins. In the Muslim world, that's very, very common. Charles Darwin married his first cousin. One of her brothers married Charles Darwin's sister. And all of her brothers and all of her sisters all married first cousins. Ooh. Why do people do that? Well, because culturally you tend to marry someone similar to you, but also it keeps the money in the family. The brother and the sister sit down and say, hey, your son marries my daughter, and we get to keep the family farm. And that's true throughout history, and it has genetic effects. It means that each little people group gets pigeonholed, and they lose diversity, and they become more and more similar to themselves and more different than other people, and that is the rise of races. It's a natural product of what's going to happen after the Tower of Babel, when God separates people and spreads them across the world. That's not an evolutionary answer. The Bible's got a great recipe for the origin of races. You ever seen something like this? The so-called out of Africa event, where we started in Africa and we spread out through the world. Have you ever seen something like that? This is based on mitochondria, the little piece of DNA that we only get from our mothers. And when you look at it and trace it back over time, the evolutionist says, we arose in Africa. But then they say this. They said, there was a single spread of people, broken up into small people groups, with one main mitochondrial ancestor, traveling through the Middle East in the recent past. Every single one of those points I made is something that we predict from the Tower of Babel account. It's staring us in the face, but they say we arose in Africa, which they cannot actually know. You cannot take a family tree and put it on a map, because people move across the world. But not only that, as I'll explain in my next lecture, when you look at the tree of all the branching things, the Africans are over here, maybe the Europeans are here, they take the halfway point, and they say that's where the ancestor was. And because the African branches are longer, the halfway point is in Africa. That's where the idea comes from, but I don't believe that just because it's longer means it's older. I'll explain that later. So I'm suggesting to you that this is the real story, and it's right there in the genetic evidence. Again, we don't need evolution to explain the origin of so-called races. Ever heard that maybe there was people outside the garden? I mean, who did Cain marry? Who was Cain worried that was going to find him and kill him after he murdered his brother? People outside the garden, right? I had one guy on an email exchange. He was adamant that black people were on the ark as animals. Oh my, I never quite heard that, and then I realized that there's some of the racist people in the world that this is what they teach, and I'm like, what are you? People outside the garden, other people. No, the Bible's clear. We started from Adam and Eve only, and all people in the world only descend from Adam and Eve. But who did Cain marry? Who was Cain worried that he's going to find him and kill him? How did Cain build a city? Well, I read an article, it's in Creation Magazine, it's now on creation.com. How old was Cain when he killed Abel? See, I always imagine teenagers, 14, 15 years old, brother gets mad at his brother and he kills him. And there's always a rock, even though the Bible does not say rock, we always have this idea of rock, right? All we know is that one guy killed the other guy. But the next time statement in the Bible is in Genesis 5. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And Seth is named replacement. Oh, Seth replaced the son that was lost. He's the next son born after the murder. We have 130 years for this murder to occur. Cain and Abel could have been great-great-grandparents by this time. Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. That's what the Bible says. So we're talking about a population that could potentially have grown to thousands of people in 130 years. At least hundreds of people. That's easy. And that's what Cain was worried about. And that's one of whom Cain married. And he could already have been a parent before this. So other people like Joshua Swamidass here on the right, he's an evolutionist. He wants to be a Christian. He thinks he's a Christian, so I'm not going to doubt that. But all he has is the death and resurrection of Christ. That's where really his linchpin that keeps him in Christianity. The rest of the Old Testament, specifically the book of Genesis, he simply doesn't believe it at all. And he claims that there were people outside the garden. I call them pogos. The pogos, people outside the garden, intermarried with Adam and Eve. And eventually, Adam and Eve's descendants are everyone in the world. But initially, there was a bunch of people and Adam and Eve only. And by the time of Christ, at least, all the people in the world were descendants of Adam. But that raises gigantic theological problems. If you want more details, I have an article, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Oh, here's what I got my talks mixed up. This is a family tree of Y chromosomes. I made this. This came from the 1,000 Genomes program. I downloaded all the Y chromosomes. I lined them up. I cleaned up the data a little bit, and I generated that with an evolutionary tree building program because I wanted to know. And there's some amazing history on this tree. Consider this. I am in group R1b, and most of you men in this room are in group R1b. Most of you. This is a classic European Y chromosome. My cousins live in India and Pakistan, R1a. Cousins, look, they're very, very similar. These branches, the length of the branch is proportional to the number of differences between two people. My more distant cousins belong to group Q. Those are Native Americans. Oh. Further on down the line, we have O. A lot of people in Japan and China belong to group O. Can you see that O is a beautiful fan? Can you see that? You know what that is? That's that's what happens when you have a population that grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. Unlike these guys out here that are very leggy, these are the Khoisan Bushmen that live in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. Here's the pygmies that live in the Central African rainforests on long, spidery branches as opposed to fluffy, full branches. There's a different population history. You can tell the population size of the people just from this. That's really interesting. But most African men belong to this group. But they branch off from non-Africans. And together they branch off from non-Africans. And together they branch off from non-Africans. And Genghis Khan belonged to Group C, the Mongolian warlord. So if these people arose from non-Africans and they're today in Africa, that means they rose outside of Africa and then invaded and took over. Oh, so not actually African, even though most of them belong to that group. Oh, history is fun, isn't it? You learn all sorts of weird things. But notice that a lot of times we have a bunch of bristles and then a stick. You see the bristle and stick model? What is that? Well, this is my broomstick model to explain this tree. At the end of the branches, we have living individuals, people alive today. The length of these little bristles is proportional to the number of letters that that person has that no one else in the tree has. So if the average mutation rate from man to son on the Y chromosome is about 1 letter per generation. So if I looked at my great-great-great-great-grandfather's great-great-great-great-grandson, which might be someone in this room, we probably differ by 3 or 4 letters. And so we would have a branch like that, maybe there. But these people, they pick them to be as unrelated as possible. And they found a whole bunch of people that have a common ancestor recently. So maybe a famous chieftain or a famous warlord or a king had a bunch of kids. And that's these people. But then they all share a common stick, which is weird. Because there should have been other branches here, but they're not there. And we're not finding them. It's as if those people never really lived. As if maybe this isn't time. Maybe there's just a giant mutational jump from there to there. You know how the patriarchs in the Bible lived for a very long time? In human females, women worry about having children late in life. Because after the age of 40, the rate of Down syndrome and things starts to increase. But the men should worry more than the women. See, eggs, they don't divide, so there's no chromosomal fixing, so chromosomes can break and stick in different places. So you get a lot of big chromosomal changes in very old women who have children. The rate just goes up. But for men, the reproductive cells divide from puberty, and they keep on dividing until the man dies. And every time a cell divides, the machines have to copy about 3 billion letters, and they tend to make about 1 mistake every billion letters. So the older the man is, the more mutations he passes to his child. We can measure that today. Noah was over 500 years old when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born. Noah was genetic poison to the future population. And what do we see after the flood? We see a lot of inbreeding, and the lifespan goes shh. The effects of very old men, Arphaxad, Eber, Shem, even Abraham, would produce children with many more mutations than is average today. People today aren't having children at 100 years old. It doesn't happen. But we are, on average, delaying childbirth until later. So instead of first birth at 20, first birth is usually around 30 now. And that actually has mutational load on the population. Creepy. Okay. Going back to this tree, with the broomstick model in our head, and our understanding that's reflecting human history. That circle is circling people that live in places where the Bible says the descendants of Ham lived. Ham did not just live in Africa. Ham also lived in Arabia, in Anatolia, in Mesopotamia. Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, he was a descendant of Ham. He lived in Mesopotamia. So it doesn't surprise me that I see some Greek and Bulgarian Y chromosomes in some of this. If you look at like the island of Papua New Guinea in the Pacific Ocean, those tribesmen actually come from radically different branches on the human family tree. But you can't look at them and tell. They're as different on their Y chromosome as almost they can possibly be, and yet you don't know that. So Papua New Guinea was settled by very different branches of the family after the flood. Strange. A lot of Jewish men belong to group J. That means maybe that is Shem. Maybe that is Japheth. Maybe that's Ham, which means Noah will be somewhere in the middle here. I don't exactly know where, but Noah, if this is Ham, Japheth, Shem, and Japheth, Noah is somewhere in the middle. And the branches then reflect the grandsons and great-grandsons of Noah. Interestingly, Genesis chapter 10 lists 16 grandsons of Noah. And there are approximately 16 major branches on that tree. Oh. Now, it doesn't mean those are the grandsons of Noah, but it means this. That is the picture we would predict based on the biblical story. Now, if you rewind history and start it again, you'll get a different picture. Do it again, you'll get a different picture, but they'll have a common theme that is this. That explosion of branches is exactly what Genesis would predict, and that is what we see. Meaning, the Bible here is screaming that it is true when you look at genetics. And the evolutionists don't realize that, or if they do, they don't want to admit it. But it's not just that, it's also the mitochondria. The little piece of DNA you only got from your mother. Now, my mother's mother was, her name is Rinskje. Rinskje. I can't pronounce it. She was from Frisia. I've had some Frisian friends of mine try to get me to pronounce the name. I can't do it. But Rinskje Everts van der Vliet. She was Frisian, and she had a rare branch of group H, H16, which is very rare in Europe. My father, strangely, has group U, which is like Neolithic. So my grandmother, who was German, her German roots are really old. But I didn't get my father's Y chromosome. I got my mother's. My children did not get my Y chromosome, mitochondria. They got my wife's. But HVR is like 80% of Europeans. Can you see that some people have longer branches than other people? And yet, even though some people have longer branches than others, they go back to the same common ancestor, right? That means that some people pick up more mutations in the same amount of time than other people. That means there's no molecular clock. That means that you can't look at the African and say, oh, look, these have long branches, therefore they're older populations. Because look at this. These people have twice as many mutations as these people, even though they have the same common ancestor. There is no molecular clock. So you cannot know how long ago Y chromosome Adam lived. You cannot know how long ago mitochondrial Eve lived. It depends on the mutation rate. And the impact of really old people having children right after the flood is going to mess up that tree entirely. So again, this is supporting, not contradicting, the biblical story. I find that really exciting. And I did not know that when I started studying this. It took me a long time to even notice that. I drew this tree myself. It took me a long time. Wait a second. That's twice as much. Look at these guys. Look. I mean, it's all over the place. Contradictions to the very important molecular clock hypothesis. Are you familiar with chapter 10 of Genesis, the table of nations, where it lists the sons and grandsons of Noah and says where they went? And so most people have in their mind that, well, Ham went to Africa and Japheth went to Europe, and therefore Shem would have settled Asia and parts of the Middle East. You kind of got that thought in your head because that's basically what we've been taught all our lives. It's not true. Because if you just look at what the Bible says on where the people lived, you see them living all over the place and on top of each other. All people are descended from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The spreading out didn't happen until after the Tower of Babel. And because God separated things according to the male lineage, that means God separated the Y chromosomes only, not the mitochondria. The daughters of Ham would have been marrying the sons of Shem. The mitochondria should have gotten scrambled in that population. There was no law that said that Hamites can't marry Shemites. There was no law at all. And before the Tower of Babel, right after the flood, there was no one else to marry. The cousins would have married each other. And all the lines would have mixed, and all the genes would have mixed, all the DNA would have mixed, and then God separated the nations according to Y chromosome. That's cool, isn't it? And yet you get pictures like this. Now, my father's 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 father was William Thomas Carter, who lived in Ireland and left after the Irish potato famine. Now, Carter's not an Irish name. It's an English name. I think my people settled in Ireland during the Elizabethan times when they basically took Northern Ireland and tried to model it after English farms. And it's called the settlement era, and it's a horrible time in Irish history. But my Y chromosome belongs to group R1b, and it's like 80% of Irish, a high percentage of European. It's also here in Norway. It's not quite found very often out in Asia, but it's heavily concentrated in Western Europe. And Cameroon. Wait a minute. The men in Cameroon have the darkest skin on the planet. And they're literally my cousins. I am more closely related to some men in Cameroon than many men in Norway. You saw the tree, right? All the branches, and R1b, the little tuft. Well, that means that after the flood, one tribe of my family migrated into Africa, and they've been there ever since. And literally, I am very closely related to them, at least on my father's side. So what's a race? I cannot define that word anymore because we're all mixtures. We can also bring in the question of Neanderthal man. Oh, for years, we were told that Neanderthal, some primitive caveman, dragging his lady by the hair, big club in his hand, and stooped over, beetle-browed, hunched, stupid. No, they don't teach that anymore. At least the younger people don't teach that because they're too smart. They've learned too much about Neanderthal. Notice that skeleton that was in the New York Museum of Natural History. Why are both of his knees bent? To make him look like a monkey. And yet from the hips down, he looks just like you. They have a bell-shaped rib cage. We have a barrel-shaped rib cage. Fine. They had much stronger jaws and bigger teeth. Fine. They had bigger muscle attachment points. And I think this part of our arm is longer than this part of our arm, and Neanderthals are opposite. I might have gotten it backwards. But they had a different ratio of the arm bones and the leg bones, so they were stocky, they were stout, they were tough, and they lived in an environment that would have killed us very quickly. They lived here when it was south of here, this is covered in glaciers, south of here when it was an incredible hostile environment, and they survived there. And yet, notice these two skulls. Which one has the bigger brains? The Neanderthal. On average, they had larger brains than modern humans. Weird. And yet, the new pictures we see of Neanderthals are very different than the old ones. Why does this reconstruction of Neanderthal child have light eyes, light skin, light hair? Because we know from genetics that some of them carried those genes. There's a diversity of skin color and hair and eye color genes amongst Neanderthals, but many of them would have been light complexioned. From the archaeological record, we know that they painted in caves. They'd made musical instruments out of deer antlers on a pentatonic scale, 5 notes to a scale like in Chinese music. They sailed across the Mediterranean and lived on islands you cannot see from the other shore, and that were never connected to the shore, and yet there's Neanderthal stuff there. They would dive 30 feet, 10 meters down, to collect clams and have a clam bake on the shore. They had makeup. They had jewelry. They boiled birch tar in an oxygen-free oven at a specific temperature to boil it down so that the tar would be just right so they could use it as a super glue to glue their spear points onto their spear shafts. While the rest of the world was pulling guts out of deer and wrapping them around, trying to keep the tip on the spear points, Neanderthals were using a super glue. Human or not? Pre-flood or post-flood? Post-flood. They're descendants of Noah. I say that because they're living in caves and things that are flood-created caves. They weren't washed into the caves. They buried their dead ceremonially in the caves. They dug into the sediments, put their dead down, and covered them over. And that's why we have their bones today, because people that died out in the field, their skeletons didn't survive till today. But there's another group of people. We don't have their skeletons. We have little fragments of bone. They're called Denisovans, after a cave in eastern Siberia near the border of Mongolia and Kazakhstan called Denisova Cave. Interesting, named after St. Denis. The Neanderthals are named after Joachim Neander, the famous hymn writer. So Neanderthals and Denisovans are both named after Christians. I thought that was funny. But they're a brand new group. They're almost as different from us as Neanderthals are. We find their DNA in Chinese, Japanese, Korean people, about 0.5%. But there's some people that live in Papua New Guinea, that live in a new group they found in the Philippines. They're up to 7% of their genome is Denisovan. Add 3% average of Neanderthal, and you have about 10% of their genome is non-human. Because humans, according to the evolutionary story, evolved in Africa. Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't live in Africa. We supposedly evolved from Homo erectus independently of Neanderthals. And yet, people can be up to 10% not Homo sapiens. And yet, they're just as beautiful as everybody else. They're just as intelligent. They're just as creative. There's no evidence that Neanderthals and Denisovans are nothing other than human, fully human. Descendants of Adam, spiritual people in need of a Savior, just like those people in the Philippines. Oh, but man, This is the hard part. I've got a few minutes left. I'm going to try to cover this and not cry. The history of race relations coming due to evolutionary theory is nothing if not tragic. There were evolutionists in the 1800s. They were saying, humans evolved from chimpanzees, and blacks evolved from gorillas, and Chinese people evolved from orangutans. That was in textbooks. There were most people, Charles Darwin specifically, he thought he was at the top of the evolutionary ladder of humans. And he wrote this in his book, Descent of Man, 1871. At some future period, not distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, which he meant himself, will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropological apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for intervening between man and a more civilized state and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between a Negro or Australian and the gorilla. This is what he was saying. In evolution, you would expect things to evolve separately, and you get like a tree. He thought he was at the top, and beneath him were Chinese, and beneath the Chinese were the Africans, and beneath the Africans were the apes. So naturally, for evolution to progress, you have to kill off your competitors so that you have the superior race survives, and now the greater gap between it and its closest cousins might be a baboon. You ever wonder where where Adolf Hitler got his ideas from? Strict application of Darwinian theory there. But it wasn't just, let's kill off the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals. It's also, let's fight a war to kill off the weak Germans. They wrote all about that. We're going to have this giant Krieg, and we're going to fight this fight, and we're going to get rid of all the weak Germans, and the German race will be stronger afterwards. Ha! Did it work? No, because who had the highest fatality rates amongst all of the Wehrmacht, or actually not the Wehrmacht, of all of the German military units? It was the SS. The strongest, the fastest, the smartest, the best. They're the ones who died the most. So who got the girls after the war? Yeah, the skinny guy back in the baggage. Not the super stud. So it's a failed application of evolutionary theory. Luis Quintana Murci is a famous geneticist, and he wrote this. I thought this was amazing. I have to use a big word here. Phenotypic. It's the way you look. Your genotype is the genes you carry. Your phenotype is the way you look and behave. The genes that explain the phenotypic differences between populations only represent a tiny part of our genome, confirming once again the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Well, happy hallelujah. Science has finally caught up with the Bible. We've known that forever. Look at Colossians 3:11. Here, that's in Christianity, there's not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave-free, but Christ is all and in all. So within Christianity, there are no racial divisions. That makes me very happy because I'm not Jewish. Consider Isaiah 59:20. A redeemer will come to Zion, to those in Jacob who turn from transgression, declares the Lord. The redeemer. You know, that word is used in the book of Ruth. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer. Naomi had sold her property and spent all the money. But she wanted her property back. She had no money. So Boaz stepped in and bought the property. He paid her debt and got Ruth in the deal, which is a nice deal for him. But he paid the debt of his relative. Isaiah here is saying that there's going to be a redeemer who turned from transgression, to those who turn from transgression. Sorry, I'm mumbling that. That redeemer applies to kin. And again, I'm not Jewish. I don't have a drop of Jewish DNA anywhere in my body. My ancestors knew nothing about the goings-on in the Bible. They lived in spiritual darkness, worshiping false gods and human sacrifice and horrible, horrible, horrible relations with their neighbors. Just say it that way. Early European history is gross. Those people were awful. Thank God missionaries came here and spread the good news of Jesus Christ and transformed this continent. I can't imagine what we would be like right now if that wasn't true. There would be blood running through the streets. These people were awful. But it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. I can be redeemed through my kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, because we're both descended from Adam. Hey, Christian, what happens if you remove Adam? What happens if he's just a mythology or not a historical reality? Then we have big spiritual problems. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, has broken down in his flesh a dividing wall of hostility. We should be praising Jesus that the gospel came to a bunch of white people who live thousands of miles away from where Jesus died. Consider also the first place outside of Israel the gospel went was to Ethiopia. When Philip went to the Ethiopian eunuch, he was on his way home to Ethiopia. So Christianity is much more an African religion than it is even a European religion. Oh, that's amazing. I love that context. I'm gonna just leave it there. I've spoken too much already. Take-home point is this. There's no scientific definition of race. There's no biblical definition of race. We are equal in the eyes of God. We're all equally fallen and equally in need of a Savior. We've all been on this earth the same amount of time, therefore we're intellectually equal. There are some skin color differences. Yeah, that's true. There's some differences in athletic ability, but it's not ubiquitous. It's not like every single African can jump really high and slam a basketball. That's not true. That's very racist even to think that. There are some Europeans who can do it also, just the ratio is a little different. So there are some statistical differences between the populations, but they're tiny and they're irrelevant. The point is, we all need Jesus. Thank you.
Ja, spennende, er det ikke? Det er herlig å kunne se, og til og med bare se at alle de forskjellige trærne matcher barnebarna til Noah. Hæ? Ganske kult. Kjempefint, da er det pause frem til vi har neste foredrag. Og benytt kiosk og andre ting, og nyt, ja, det er mulig at det skimter sol ute, og i hvert fall så er det ikke regn. Og vi som kom fra Østlandet til Vestlandet, vi tenker jo, nå skal vi bare få regn i mange dager, så vi er jo veldig happy for at det er så bra vær her. Så da kan vi nyte det og få litt luft, sånn at vi klarer å ha hjernen sånn noenlunde oppegående til neste sesjon.